Solveig Marsh stood in her grandmother's sewing room with a screwdriver in one hand and 11 years of silence in the other. The machine in front of her was an old Singer, black enamel worn down to bare metal at the edges, a foot pedal that still smelled faintly of machine oil after all this time. Everyone who'd looked at it, the appraiser from the estate sale, the neighbor who wanted it for parts, even the pawn shop on Fifth Street, had called it junk. Sentimental, sure. Worth something to nobody but her. But Grandma Odalys had left a note tucked inside an old Bible. 3 words underlined twice. "Look underneath, Solveig." With trembling hands, Solveig flipped the machine onto its side and found 4 screws she'd never noticed before, hidden under decades of dust and thread. The base came loose, and what fell out onto the sewing room floor wasn't a pincushion or a spool of thread. It was a folded piece of paper that would change everything Solveig thought she knew about the woman who raised her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Solveig had buried her grandmother on a Tuesday that felt too ordinary for the size of what she'd lost. The funeral home on Route 9 had given her a discount because she paid in cash, money she didn't have, pulled from a savings account that existed mostly on paper. Odalys Finn had raised her from the age of 7, after Solveig's parents split in a way that left no room for a child, and for 18 years the two of them had shared a narrow house on Larkspur Street in a river town that had been dying slowly since the mill closed. Solveig didn't remember much about her mother. She remembered everything about her grandmother. The smell of her kitchen, the sound of the sewing machine running late into the night when money was tight, and Odalys took in mending work from half the town. The way she hummed to herself, off-key, while she worked. The last 2 years had gutted whatever savings existed. Odalys's heart had started failing when Solveig was 23, and the hospital visits piled up the way debt always does, quietly, then all at once. Solveig had taken a leave from her job at the hardware store to care for her, then lost the job entirely when the leave ran too long. She'd sold her car. She'd sold most of her own furniture. By the time Odalys passed in her sleep on a rainy March morning, the medical bills alone had climbed past $60,000, and the house on Larkspur Street, the only home Solveig had ever really had, carried a lien from an unpaid loan Odalys had taken out years before without ever mentioning it. Solveig found out about the lien from a letter that arrived 2 days after the funeral. Thaddeus Crane, an estate liquidator working for the bank, had been assigned to the property. He called before she'd even opened the letter fully, his voice smooth in a way that made her skin prickle. 60 days, he told her. 60 days to settle the debt, or the house would go to auction, contents included. He mentioned the contents twice. She noticed. She didn't think much of it at the time. There wasn't much in that house worth auctioning off. A second-hand couch, a television from 2009, and in the back room, a sewing machine older than Solveig herself. One Odalys had never once let her take apart or clean too thoroughly, not even when Solveig, as a teenager, had wanted to oil the gears herself. "Don't touch the base, sweetheart," Odalys used to say. "You'll throw off the tension." Solveig had thought it was just an old woman being particular about her tools. She'd never once questioned it. In 18 years, Odalys had never given her a reason to doubt anything she said. Now, standing in the sewing room with the house's future counted down in weeks instead of years, Solveig thought about that sentence for the first time in a decade. She thought about the Bible with the note tucked inside its cover, the one she'd found while boxing up her grandmother's things for a donation pile she hadn't had the strength to finish. "Look underneath." 2 words that meant nothing until she was on her knees on the sewing room floor with a screwdriver, prying loose 4 screws that had been hidden under grime for who knew how many years. The folded paper that fell out wasn't large. It was old, the creases gone soft with age, the kind of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it threatened to tear along the seams. Solveig picked it up carefully, the way she might handle something alive. On the outside, in her grandmother's handwriting, 3 words were written in fading blue ink. "For when needed." Solveig's hands were shaking too hard to unfold it right away. She sat back against the wall of the sewing room, the old Singer looming over her like it had been waiting 18 years to finally speak. And for a long moment, She just held the paper against her chest, breathing in the smell of oil and dust and something underneath it she couldn't quite name. Whatever her grandmother had hidden in that machine, it hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been carelessness. It had been kept there on purpose, sealed away for a moment exactly like this one. Slowly, Solveig began to unfold it. Solveig unfolded the paper on the floor of the sewing room, careful with every crease, the way she used to unfold birthday cards from her grandmother as a child, savoring the moment before she knew what was inside. What she found wasn't a letter. It was a map, hand-drawn in the same fading blue ink as the note on the outside, the lines steady and deliberate in a way that told her this hadn't been sketched in a hurry. A winding road. A creek marked with 3 careful wavy lines. An X, circled twice, sitting at the edge of a plot of land labeled in small, careful print. Birch Hollow. Solveig had never heard of it. She'd lived in this town her whole life, had walked every street within 5 miles of Larkspur, had ridden her bike as a kid down every gravel road that led out past the old mill, and she had never once heard her grandmother mention a place called Birch Hollow. Underneath the map, in handwriting slightly shakier than the note on the front, Odalys had written a single line. 14 acres, paid for in secret, 22 years of Tuesdays. Bring the machine's needle plate. You'll know what I mean when you're standing there. None of it made sense yet, but Solveig felt something she hadn't felt since before the funeral, a small, sharp thread of hope pulling tight in her chest. She sat with the map in her lap for a long time, the afternoon light shifting across the sewing room floor, and thought about all the Tuesdays of her life. Odalys had always left the house on Tuesdays, every week, without fail, telling Solveig she was going to visit an old friend across town or run errands that took longer than they should have. Solveig had never questioned it. She'd been a teenager wrapped up in her own life, then a young woman wrapped up in keeping her grandmother alive, and it had never once occurred to her to ask where those Tuesdays actually went. 22 years of Tuesdays. Solveig did the math without meaning to. That put the start of it back before she'd even come to live on Larkspur Street, back when Odalys would have been in her late 40s, working double shifts at the textile mill before it closed and taking and mending on the side just to keep the lights on. Whatever this was, whatever Birch Hollow held, her grandmother had been building it before Solveig was even part of her life, and had kept building it quietly every single week, straight through raising a granddaughter who wasn't hers by blood, straight through failing health, straight through everything. Solveig went back to the sewing machine and ran her hand along the underside of the base where the paper had been hidden. There, she found the second thing Odalys had tucked away, a small metal plate, no bigger than a playing card, etched with a serial number and a symbol that looked almost like a compass rose. The needle plate. Solveig turned it over in her fingers, cold and heavier than it should have been for its size, and understood without being able to explain how she understood it that this wasn't decorative. It was a key of some kind, though to what, she had no idea yet. She thought about calling someone right then. Her first instinct was Bettina Suarez, the woman 2 houses down who'd brought over casseroles for a month after the funeral and who'd known Odalys longer than Solveig had been alive. But something stopped her. The note had said for when needed, and part of her wanted to understand what she was looking at before she brought it to another living soul. She folded the map back along its worn creases, tucked it and the metal plate into the inside pocket of her jacket, and sat on the floor of the sewing room until the light outside turned orange, then gray, then gone. It was nearly 7 in the evening when her phone buzzed on the windowsill. A text from an unknown number, the area code local. "This is Thaddeus Crane from the Banks Estate Division. Wanted to check in on the property, Ms. Marsh. 58 days left on the notice. Let me know if you'd like help finding a quicker path forward. Sometimes there's more value in a house's contents than people realize." Solveig read the message twice, and something about the phrase "more value in a house's contents than people realize" sat wrong in her stomach. A fishhook she couldn't quite place. She hadn't told him about the sewing machine. She hadn't told anyone. But he'd said it like a man fishing for something specific, testing the water to see what she'd give away. She didn't answer him that night. Instead, she sat back down on the floor of the sewing room, the map and the strange metal plate heavy in her jacket pocket, and looked at the old singer sitting silent in the corner, its black enamel catching the last bit of light through the window. 22 years, her grandmother had written. 22 years of a secret Solveig had walked past every single Tuesday of her life without ever once noticing it was there. Tomorrow, she decided she would find Birch Hollow. Tonight, for the first time since the funeral, she let herself cry without trying to stop it. Not from grief this time, but from something that felt almost like being loved from beyond the edge of what should have been possible. Solveig didn't sleep that night. She lay on the couch in the front room with the map spread flat on the coffee table. The lamp turned low, tracing the wavy lines of the creek with her finger until she'd all but memorized the route. In the morning, she drove to the county records office on 4th Street before it even opened, sitting in her car in the parking lot with a cup of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder, watching the clerk unlock the doors at 9 sharp. The woman behind the counter, a heavy-set clerk named Doris who'd worked there longer than Solveig had been alive, pulled up the parcel records for Birch Hollow without much trouble. 14 acres, the deed read, purchased in 1998 under the name Odalys R. Fenn, paid in full, no mortgage attached. Solveig stared at the date. 1998. For years before Solveig had even been born, 6 years before her parents' marriage fell apart and left a 7-year-old on her grandmother's doorstep. Whatever this land was, whatever her grandmother had been building out there, it had started before Solveig existed at all, which meant the 22 years of Tuesdays hadn't been about her. Not at first. That thought sat strange in her chest. Not quite painful, just unfamiliar, like finding out a person you loved had a whole other life running parallel to the one you shared with them. The address on the deed led her 20 minutes outside town, past the last gas station, down a gravel road that turned to dirt where the county stopped maintaining it. Solveig's car wasn't built for it. She parked where the road narrowed to little more than a footpath and walked the rest, the map from the sewing machine base folded in her jacket pocket, the strange metal plate cold against her palm where she kept turning it over without meaning to. The trees here were mostly birch, white bark peeling in long curls, and she understood the name of the place before she'd gone 100 yards further. She found the creek first, exactly where the map showed it, 3 careful bends that matched the wavy lines in her grandmother's hand almost perfectly. She followed it upstream for another quarter mile, her boots sinking into mud left over from a rain 2 days before, until the trees opened into a small clearing. And there, sitting at the edge of the clearing exactly where the X had been circled twice, was a structure that made her stop walking entirely. It wasn't a shed. It wasn't a house either. Not quite. It was something in between, a squat building made of fieldstone and timber, maybe 20 feet across, with a single door bolted shut and windows boarded over from the inside. Whatever it was, it had been built with care. The stonework was old but solid, mortar lines clean even after decades of weather, the kind of work that took real time and real money. Nothing about it looked like it belonged to a woman who'd spent her days hemming other people's pants for spare cash. Solveig approached slowly, her heart going harder than the walk alone could explain. The door was fitted with a heavy iron lock, older than any lock she'd seen outside of an antique shop, and beneath it, half hidden by a curtain of ivy someone had clearly meant to keep trimmed back and hadn't, in years, was a small brass plate etched with a symbol. A compass rose, identical to the one on the needle plate in her pocket. Her hands shook as she pulled the plate free from her jacket and held it up to the lock. It didn't fit into a keyhole. Not exactly, there wasn't one to fit into. Instead, there was a slot beneath the compass rose etching, sized almost exactly for the small metal plate she was holding. She pressed it in. For a moment nothing happened, and Solveig felt something in her chest sink, certain she'd misread the whole thing, certain this was some elaborate deed and her grandmother had left behind by accident. Then she heard it. A mechanism inside the door shifted, a deep metallic sound like a bolt sliding free from decades of rust, and the door gave an inch under its own weight. Solveig stood there in the clearing with her hands still on the door, birds somewhere overhead, the creek running quiet behind her, and found she couldn't make herself push it open. Not yet. 22 years, her grandmother had written. 22 years of secrecy, built on land Solveig hadn't known existed, protected by a lock that needed a piece of an old sewing machine to open. Whatever was on the other side of that door was about to answer a question Solveig hadn't even known she'd been carrying her whole life, which was simply this. Who had Odalys Fenn actually been, underneath the woman who raised her. She thought of Thaddeus Crane's text from the night before, more value in a house's contents than people realize, and wondered with a chill how he could possibly have known to say something like that. Had someone else known about this place? Had her grandmother told anyone at all? Or had Solveig been meant to be the only one standing here, ever? The wind picked up through the birch trees, cool for early spring, and somewhere behind her a branch cracked, the kind of sound that made her spin around fast, scanning the tree-line for movement that wasn't there. She was alone. She told herself she was alone, but the feeling crawling up the back of her neck didn't fully believe it. And for the first time since she'd found the map, Solveig wondered if finding this place had put a target on her back that she didn't yet understand the size of. She turned back to the door, put both hands against the old wood, and pushed. Solveig pushed the door open, and the hinges gave with a groan that seemed too big for a door that size, disturbing dust that had sat undisturbed for what looked like years. She stood on the threshold for a second before stepping in, and the smell hit her first. Cedar, and something sweeter underneath it, dried lavender maybe, packed in somewhere to keep moths away. Not the smell of neglect. The smell of something cared for and sealed up on purpose. She fumbled for her phone and turned on the flashlight, and the beam cut through a room that was nothing like she expected. No junk. No rusted farm tools or broken furniture shoved in for storage. The walls were lined with wooden frames, dozens of them, each one holding a quilt stretched taut and preserved behind clear panels that looked almost like museum glass. Solveig moved the light slowly across the first row and felt her breath catch somewhere in her throat. The stitching was unlike anything she'd seen her grandmother make for the house. Intricate scenes worked entirely in fabric and thread. A river bending through a town. A mill with smoke curling from its stack. A young girl on a porch step, her dress patched from a dozen different fabrics, unmistakably rendered even in miniature. Solveig stepped closer to that one, her hand hovering just above the glass without touching it. The girl on the porch had a birthmark on her left cheek, small and shaped like a comma. Solveig had the exact same mark in the exact same place. This was her. Odalys had stitched her into fabric years before Solveig had any memory of being that small. In the center of the room stood a long wooden table, and on it sat a wooden chest with brass corners, unlocked, the lid slightly ajar as though someone had left it that way on purpose, waiting. Solveig set her phone down so the light angled up toward the ceiling and lifted the lid. Inside, everything was organized with the same care she remembered from her grandmother's kitchen drawers, each item wrapped in tissue paper that had gone slightly yellow with age. Photographs, receipts, a leather-bound journal with a cracked spine, and near the bottom, a folder thick with paper, the kind of folder someone builds over a very long time, one document at a time. She opened the folder first. The top page was a bill of sale, dated 1999, for a lot of antique fabric and thread purchased from an estate auction in Ohio, the price listed at $1,100, a sum that must have taken Odalys months to save on a mill worker's wages. Behind it, more receipts spanning years, then decades, for fabric, dye, thread, framing materials, each one a small piece of a puzzle Solveig was only beginning to understand the shape of. Near the middle of the folder, she found photographs of individual quilts in progress, some barely begun, just a few stitches against blank cloth, others nearly finished, her grandmother's hands visible at the edge of a few frames, younger hands, unlined, holding a needle with the same steadiness Solveig remembered from her childhood. The journal was harder to read. Odalys's handwriting had changed over the years, careful and small in the early entries, looser and more urgent in the later ones. Solveig sat on the dirt floor of the stone building with her back against the wooden chest and began reading from the beginning. March 1998. Bought the land today. Told no one, not even Ruth at the mill, who tells everyone everything. 14 acres and a dream nobody would understand if I said it out loud. I want to make something that outlasts a paycheck. Something that means the work of my hands was worth more than what this town ever paid for it. Solveig turned the pages slowly, watching the years pass in her grandmother's own words. Entries about fabric sourced from estate sales 3 counties over. Entries about a technique Odalys had taught herself from library books, since nobody in town could show her how. And then, further in, an entry that made Solveig stop and read it twice. June 2004. Solveig came to live with me this spring. Sweet, quiet, scared of everything after what her parents did. I stitched her into the river piece last night after she went to sleep. Didn't tell her. Won't tell her. This work isn't about being seen. It's about being ready for whenever the day comes that she needs more than I can give her while I'm alive to give it. Solveig pressed the journal to her chest the same way she'd held the folded map the day before, tears coming fast now, silent, running down into the collar of her jacket. Her grandmother had been building this her entire childhood. Every Tuesday Solveig had assumed was an errand or a visit to a friend had actually been this. Hours spent alone in a stone room stitching a life's work that nobody else on earth had ever seen. Near the very bottom of the chest, tucked beneath the journal, she found a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in the same fading blue ink as the map. Not a single letter, she realized, lifting it out carefully. A stack, each one numbered, each one dated for a birthday years into the future, the way a person plans for a life they know they won't be present for. She opened the first one, the one marked with this year's date, her hands shaking too hard to be gentle with the seal. My dearest Solveig, if you are reading this, then you've found the hollow, and that means I'm gone, and I am sorrier than any words on this page could ever hold that I'm not there to walk you through it myself. I always imagined I'd be the one to open that door with you, to watch your face when you saw what 30 years of Tuesdays turned into. I suppose life doesn't often let us choose the moment, so I'll try to explain it here instead. You know by now that I bought this land before you ever came to me. What you don't know is why. I grew up poor in a poor town, and every woman in my family before me worked her hands raw for wages that never matched the work. My mother sewed for the mill until her fingers curled from arthritis, and when she died, she left behind nothing but a Bible and a debt. I swore I would leave something different behind. Not money, because I never had much of that to spare. Something made. Something that would prove the hours counted for more than a paycheck. I started with small pieces, nothing worth much, just practice. But somewhere in the second or third year, I understood I wasn't just making quilts anymore. I was making a record. Every quilt in that room tells a piece of this town's story. The mill, the river, the families who came and went. Historians would call it folk art if they ever saw it. I called it my second job, the one that paid in nothing but purpose, until the day it might finally pay in something real. Solveig read the letter twice through tears that blurred the ink on the second pass, then set it down on top of the chest and opened the folder again, this time with different eyes. She understood now what she was looking at wasn't sentiment. It was documentation, decades of it, receipts and photographs building a paper trail the same way Odalys had built the quilts themselves, one careful stitch at a time. Near the back of the folder, she found something she'd skimmed past the first time, a newspaper clipping, brittle and yellowed, from a regional arts magazine dated 11 years earlier. The headline read, "Unknown Rust Belt Quilters Work Surfaces at Regional Folk Art Show. Draws national attention." Solveig sat up straighter. She hadn't known her grandmother had ever shown this work publicly. The article was short, 3 paragraphs, describing a single quilt entered anonymously into a regional competition under the name O. Fen, a piece depicting a mill town in decline that had, according to the writer, moved at least one juror to tears. The piece had won its category. There was no photograph of Odalys attached, no follow-up interview. She'd entered it, won, and vanished back into her sewing room without collecting whatever attention had come her way. Solveig went back to the journal, flipping forward past the entry about her arrival, searching for anything connected to the article. She found it 2 years later in the timeline. Entered the river piece in the regional show under initials only. Told the woman at the registration desk I was entering on behalf of my grandmother, who couldn't travel. Felt strange lying, but I couldn't have my name out there. Not with Solveig still so young, and the mill closing, and everyone in town looking for something to gossip about. Won first in category. The prize money went straight into fabric and framing supplies. Nobody needs to know where the money came from as long as it keeps going back into the work. Solveig understood then what the second letter, still unopened in the stack, might explain further, but she made herself finish reading the first one before moving on. Odalys had written near the bottom of the page a set of instructions. numbered in precise the way she'd numbered everything else in her life. There's a man named Elias Thorncroft who runs a folk art gallery 2 hours from here, in the city. He came to the regional show the year I won and left his card with the registration desk, asking after Finn. I never called him. I was afraid of what it would mean being known, being watched, having people ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. But I kept his card in this chest for 11 years, because some part of me always knew that one day you would be the one to make that call instead of me. Call him Solveig. Tell him who you are. Tell him what you found. He will know exactly what he's looking at, and he will treat it honestly, because he's the only person I ever trusted enough to leave this instruction for. Solveig found the business card at the very bottom of the chest, exactly where Odalys said it would be, the ink faded but still legible. Elias Thorncroft Folk Art Gallery. An address in the city, a phone number with an area code she didn't recognize as local anymore, the exchange having likely changed hands more than once in 11 years. She sat there a long while with the card in one hand and the letter in the other, the beam of her phone's flashlight starting to dim against the stone walls around her, and thought about how close she had come to never finding any of this. If she'd sold the sewing machine to the pawn shop on 5th Street, like she'd almost done in her first week of grief, exhausted and desperate for cash. If she'd never noticed the note in the Bible. If Thaddeus Crane's 60-day countdown had pushed her into a decision before she'd had the chance to look underneath. The thought of Crane brought her back to the message from the night before. More value in a house's contents than people realize, and this time the fishhook feeling in her stomach pulled sharper. Someone had known, or suspected, that there was more to the house than furniture and a mortgage. Solveig gathered the letters, the journal, and the folder back into the chest, closed the lid, and knew before she'd even reached the door of the stone building that whatever came next, she wasn't going to be able to keep this quiet for long. Solveig called Elias Thorncroft the next morning from the kitchen table on Larkspur Street, the business card propped against a coffee mug, her hands cold despite the steam rising off her cup. The man who answered had a voice that sounded older than she expected, warm but businesslike, the voice of someone used to being asked for things he couldn't always give. When she said her grandmother's name, Odalys Finn, there was a pause on the other end of the line long enough that Solveig wondered if the call had dropped. "Oh, Finn," he said finally. "I have wondered about that name for 11 years. Is she well?" Solveig told him. She heard him exhale slowly, the sound of a man absorbing bad news he'd half expected. He asked if he could come see the work himself, that week if possible, and something in the way he asked, careful, almost reverent, told her he understood the stakes better than she did. She gave him directions to Birch Hollow and hung up feeling, for the first time since the funeral, like she wasn't carrying this alone. She didn't get the chance to feel that way for long. Thaddeus Crane showed up at the house on Larkspur Street that same afternoon, unannounced, his car parked crooked in the driveway like he'd pulled in fast. He knocked twice, then let himself lean against the doorframe when Solveig opened the door, a folder tucked under one arm. "Ms. Marsh," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach past his teeth. "I wanted to check in personally. 56 days now. I know grief makes it hard to think clearly about these things. I brought some paperwork that might simplify your options." Solveig didn't invite him in. "What options?" "The bank can expedite a private sale of the property and its contents before the lien matures," he said. "Saves you the embarrassment of a public auction. I've got a buyer already lined up, actually a collector who specializes in, let's call it rural Americana. Old tools, textiles, that sort of thing. He'd pay a flat sum for the house and whatever's inside it. Quick, clean, done before the 60 days are up." Solveig felt the fishhook in her stomach again, sharper this time. "Textiles." Crane's smile flickered, just barely, but she caught it. "Just a figure of speech," he said. "Old houses tend to have old fabric lying around. Quilts, linens, that kind of thing. My buyer likes anything with a story." She told him she wasn't interested and closed the door before he could say anything else, then stood in the front hallway with her back against the wood, breathing hard. He knew something. She didn't know how, but he knew there was more in that house, or connected to it, than furniture and a mortgage, and the realization sat in her chest like a stone dropped down a well, waiting to hit bottom. 2 days later, the collector arrived without warning. Solveig was at Birch Hollow when Bettina Suarez called her cell, breathless, saying a man in an expensive coat had shown up at the Larkspur house asking questions about Odalys, about the sewing machine, about whether Solveig had found anything unusual in her grandmother's things. Bettina hadn't told him anything, but she'd gotten his name off the card he left. Ambrose Voigt, an art dealer based 2 states over. Solveig drove back to town with her hands tight on the wheel and found Voigt's card wedged in her own screen door when she arrived, along with a handwritten note. Ms. Marsh, I understand you may have inherited work by an unrecognized folk artist. I specialize in exactly this kind of discovery and can offer a fair cash price today. No waiting on galleries or appraisers who will only take a cut. Call me before you commit to anyone else. She called Thorncroft instead, her voice tighter than she meant it to be, and told him everything: Crane's visit, the buyer he'd mentioned, Voigt showing up out of nowhere with a card that used the words unrecognized folk artist like he already knew exactly what he was looking for. Thorncroft went quiet for a moment on the line. Ambrose Voigt, he said finally. I know that name. He's not a collector in the way he wants you to believe. He buys undervalued work from people who don't know what they have and resells it for 10, sometimes 20 times what he paid. He's fast, and he's good at sounding like your friend. Don't sign anything. Don't sell anything. I'm coming out there tomorrow morning, and I'm bringing someone with me who can put a real number on what your grandmother made. Solveig asked him how Voigt could possibly have found out so quickly, and Thorncroft's answer landed heavier than she expected. Small towns talk, he said, and banks talk to buyers they've worked with before when there's a commission in it for the person doing the introducing. She thought of Crane's crooked car in the driveway, his folder of paperwork, the flat sum he'd offer for the house and its contents, and understood with a cold certainty that the 2 men weren't circling this by coincidence. Somewhere between the estate liquidator assigned to her grandmother's debt and the dealer who showed up 2 days later asking about unrecognized folk art, a conversation had happened that Solveig had never been part of, and she was 54 days away from losing the leverage to stop it. Elias Thorncroft arrived at Birch Hollow the next morning with a woman Solveig hadn't expected, tall, silver-haired, dressed plainly except for a pair of glasses that looked expensive in the way that quiet things often are. Thorncroft introduced her as Dr. Amara Alconco-Reyes, a folk art historian who consulted for 2 major museums and had spent the better part of her career tracking down exactly the kind of anonymous regional work Odalys had spent 30 years making in secret. Dr. Alconco-Reyes didn't say much when she first stepped into the stone building. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the framed quilts lining the walls, then walked the room slowly, the way Solveig imagined a person might walk through a church they'd traveled a long way to see. She stopped in front of the piece with the young girl on the porch step, the one with the comma-shaped birthmark, and studied it without speaking for what felt like a full minute. This is her, she said finally, glancing at Solveig. You. Solveig nodded, unable to trust her voice yet. Dr. Alconco-Reyes moved to the next piece, then the next, occasionally photographing a corner or a stitch pattern with a small camera she pulled from her bag, murmuring things to herself that Solveig only half caught. Reverse applique. Hand-dyed, not commercial. This palette is unusual for the region. When she finally turned back to Solveig, her expression had shifted into something careful and direct. Ms. Marsh, I want to be honest with you before we go any further. What your grandmother made here is not simply well done. It's significant. Outsider and folk art from women working in industrial decline towns, made in isolation, without formal training, without a gallery relationship. This is exactly the kind of work museums have spent the last 2 decades trying to recover and can rarely find because most of it was thrown away or burned in house fires or lost when the maker died and nobody understood what they were looking at. You didn't throw it away. That alone puts you ahead of almost every story like this one I've encountered. Solveig asked the question she'd been carrying since the moment she'd found the first letter. What is it worth? Dr. Alconco-Reyes considered the question with the same care she'd given the quilts. I can't give you a formal appraisal on the spot. That requires documentation review, condition reports, provenance research. But based on comparable sales of rediscovered outsider art of this quality and volume, and factoring in the newspaper coverage from the regional show, which establishes a public record of recognition, I would estimate this collection, as a whole, in the range of $800,000 to $1.2 million. Possibly more if the right institutions compete for it. The number didn't feel real to Solveig. She'd expected thousands, maybe tens of thousands if she was lucky, enough to clear the lean and breathe for the first time in 2 years. She hadn't let herself imagine anything close to what Dr. Reyes had just said out loud in a cold stone building 2 hours from anywhere. Thorncroft spoke up then, quieter than before. That's why Voight showed up so fast, and why Crane brought you paperwork before you'd even had a chance to think. Men like that can smell undervalued work the way sharks smell blood in water. They count on grief and deadlines to close a deal before the seller understands what she's holding. If you'd sold this to Voight for whatever flat sum he offered, you'd likely have lost the vast majority of its true value, and your grandmother's name would have vanished into his private collection, never publicly credited, never seen by anyone who could understand what she built. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Solveig sat down on the edge of the wooden chest, the weight of the numbers still settling over her. She thought about Crane's 54-day countdown, about Voight's note wedged in her screen door, about how close she'd come to answering either of their calls out of exhaustion alone. She thought about her grandmother stitching alone in this room every Tuesday for 30 years, never once telling anyone, never once asking for credit, building something worth more than the entire town on Larkspur Street had ever paid her for a lifetime of mending other people's clothes. Dr. Reyes crouched beside her, her voice gentler now. I'd like to propose something, if you're open to it. My museum has an acquisition fund specifically for recovering overlooked regional artists, women especially, whose work never had the chance to reach the audience it deserved. I believe we could offer a fair price for the core collection, properly appraised, properly documented, and I would want to build an exhibition around your grandmother's story. Her name on the wall this time, not initials, not anonymous. Solveig looked around the room at 30 years of her grandmother's hidden work, at the girl on the porch step with her own birthmark stitched into the fabric before she'd even understood what love like that looked like, and felt something settle in her chest for the first time since the funeral, something that wasn't quite peace yet, but was closer to it than she'd been in weeks. I need to think about the exact terms, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. But yes, I want people to know her name. The following week moved faster than Solveig had braced herself for. Dr. Reyes returned to the city and came back 3 days later with a formal offer from the museum's acquisition board. $950,000 for the full collection, 22 quilts, the journal, and the letters, with an additional clause Solveig hadn't expected. The museum wanted to fund a small satellite exhibit in her own town first, in the old mill building that had sat empty since it closed, before the collection moved permanently to the city. Bring her home before you bring her national, Dr. Reyes said. Seemed right, given where the work came from. Solveig signed the paperwork at Thorncroft's gallery, a lawyer he'd recommended sitting beside her the whole time, reading every line out loud before she initialed it. When it was done, she sat in her car in the parking lot for a long while, the signed contract on the passenger seat, and let herself cry the way she hadn't since the day she'd first opened the letters in the stone building. Not from grief this time, from something that felt like her grandmother finally being seen. Thaddeus Crane called 4 times that week. Solveig let the first 3 go to voicemail. On the 4th, she picked up, mostly so she could hear herself say what she'd been waiting to say. Ms. Marsh, she said, his voice still smooth, still practiced. I heard there's been some activity out at the old Fenn property. I want to make sure you understand your options are still open. My buyer's offer stands, and frankly, with the deadline closing in, you'd be wise to take a guaranteed sum rather than gamble on a museum deal that might fall through. It didn't fall through, Solveig said. It's signed. $950,000, and my grandmother's name is going on a wall in the mill building before the year is out. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she almost hung up first. He started, then stopped. That's quite a sum for some old quilts. They're not old quilts, Solveig said. They're 30 years of her life that nobody bothered to notice until I refused to sell them to the first man who showed up at my door with a folder and a deadline. I'll be paying off the lien in full by Friday, Mr. Crane. You can cancel whatever paperwork you were preparing for Mr. Voight. She hung up before he could answer, and sat in her kitchen on Larkspur Street with the phone still warm in her hand, feeling something unclench in her chest that had been tight since the morning of the funeral. Voight never called at all. Thorncroft told her later he'd heard through the regional dealer circuit that Voight had backed off the moment word got out the museum was involved, unwilling to compete publicly for something he'd hoped to acquire quietly for a fraction of its worth. Some men only circle when they think nobody's watching, Thorncroft said. The moment it becomes public, they lose their advantage. Friday morning, Solveig walked into the bank on 4th Street and handed a cashier's check to a loan officer who wasn't Crane, since he'd apparently taken a sudden and unexplained transfer to a branch 2 counties over. The lien was cleared. The house on Larkspur Street was hers, free and clear, for the first time since before she was born. She used part of what remained to pay off the last of her grandmother's medical debt, and part of it to fix the roof that had been leaking since the winter before Odalys died. But the sewing room, she left almost entirely as it was. She moved the old singer to the center of the room, cleaned it properly for the first time in years, oiled the gears the way she'd wanted to as a teenager, and set it beneath the window where the light came in best. In the fall, the mill building reopened its doors for the first time in over a decade, not as a factory but as a gallery. 22 quilts hung under proper lighting for the first time in their existence. A placard beside the door reading the hidden work of Odalys Finn, 1998 to the present. Half the town showed up for the opening. Bettina Suarez cried through most of it. Even Doris from the records office came, saying she'd pulled that deed 100 times over the years and never once imagined what it would turn out to hold. Solveig used part of the remaining funds to start a small fund in her grandmother's name, offering grants to older women in the region working in overlooked craft, quilting, weaving, woodworking, whatever quiet skill had gone unpaid and unnoticed for most of their lives. She called it the Tuesday Fund, after 30 years of afternoons nobody had known to ask about. People ask me sometimes what the lesson in all this is, and I think about it differently than I did in the beginning. It isn't really about the money, even though the money saved everything I had left. It's about how much of the people we love goes unseen while they're alive, simply because we never think to ask what they do with their quiet hours. My grandmother spent 30 years building something extraordinary 2 hours outside of town that never paid her enough to be seen for anything at all, and she never once asked for credit while she was living. She just left instructions for someone to find it after. If there's a lesson in that, it's this. Look underneath the things people leave behind. Sometimes the plainest object in the room, an old sewing machine nobody thought was worth saving, is holding the whole story of a person you thought you already knew completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.